So Soundtoys have released SpaceBlender, and this is potentially my new favorite reverb plugin for a variety of reasons, and I want to talk about them in this video. Also, if you're watching this video before the 22nd of May 2025, SpaceBlender is currently free, so give it a download because it's really, really awesome. Let's dive into why I think it's really cool and why I think it's such a unique reverb plugin. So here I've got just a track loaded up in Ableton Live playing a drum break, and on this track I've got SpaceBlender loaded up. Let's pull the mix all the way down to 0 so that you can hear the original drums. And then let's increase the mix control so you can start to hear what SpaceBlender sounds like on the default settings when you first load it up. So by default, we have this kind of really, really large reverb. On the surface, SpaceBlender is actually quite simple. We've only got these 5 main controls down here: time, color, texture, mod, mix, and then we have this kind of interface here, which is the main core of the plugin, which I'll get to in a moment. First of all, let's talk about these main 5 controls down here. We have the time control, which of course just controls the time or the length of the reverb. We have color, which kind of controls the frequency balance of the reverb. If I increase this, we're kind of making the reverb brighter, and if I decrease it, we're making it duller. Texture here is basically increasing the density of the reverb. As I increase this, you'll see the kind of reverb display here gets a lot denser and more noisy. And as I decrease this, you'll see it starts to get a lot more grainy and kind of stuttered. So take a listen to what happens as I change this texture control as we're listening to this drum break through the reverb. So you can go all the way from these really kind of nice lush spaces to this really artificial sounding digital grainy reverb thing. Next, we have this mod control, which is effectively just applying a chorus onto the reverb as far as I can tell. At a higher level, we get more modulation and more kind of randomness in the reverb, and at a lower level, it's more static and kind of less lively. This is probably a bit easier to hear if I increase the mix up to 100% and maybe increase the time too. It's a really subtle effect, but it's really nice to be able to have this as a control here. Then of course we have the mix control, which just goes from 0% to 100%, and the freeze control here as well, which allows us to freeze the reverb. And this is really awesome when we start to play around with the time control here. And why it's really cool in conjunction with the time control is because of this little warp option right here. If I turn this warp option on, take a listen to what happens as I adjust the time of the reverb. We kind of get this tape slowdown or speed up effect, which is really, really awesome. And then combine this with the freeze control and you can create some really wild textures just from the reverb. So what I'm going to do is play this, turn on the freeze, stop playing so that we just hear the reverb, and then play around with this time control whilst the reverb is frozen. So you can get some really wild effects, and we're gonna play around with this later on when we make some cool sounds. Now by default, the time is set in milliseconds. We can also actually sync it to the BPM of our session, controlling it in beats here, all the way from 1 beat up to 32 beats, which is really cool. But now we get into the most unique part of the plugin, which is this view right here, which actually allows us to shape the envelope of the reverb in a really, really cool way. Let's turn off the freeze, decrease the mix here a little bit, set our time back to milliseconds. And then you'll see here in this kind of main view, we have this tiny little purple dot, which if I click and drag this around, we can see it actually shapes the reverb or the amplitude of the reverb in this really cool way. The y-axis or the vertical axis here allows us to control the amplitude of the reverb, and the x-axis allows us to control kind of where that amplitude spike is occurring. And this is why you're potentially hearing that reverb kind of cut off in an unusual way, because by default it starts up around here, which means that the reverb doesn't trail out, it just cuts off right at the end. If I go ahead and just play a single drum hit from this drum break, you'll kind of hear what I mean. It just cuts off right at the end, kind of like a gated reverb. If I drag this all the way down and all the way to the left, now we get this kind of decaying reverb like we're typically used to. I can increase the time. Or I could drag this purple node across to, say, the center, and now we get this kind of reverb swell in the middle of the reverb tail, which is really cool. I could decrease the kind of effect of this swell by bringing up this node just a little bit. Or I could have a fully kind of reversed reverb by dragging it all the way to the right and down to the bottom right corner. And this is where syncing this to the tempo of your DAW is really useful, because we can kind of sync this reversed reverb effect. For example, I could go ahead and set this to 1 beat, and now this reverse reverb swell is going to be exactly 1 beat long from when it first receives a sound. And if we play this with our drum break, we get a really interesting sound. Now, of course, whilst we're playing a sound, we can also click and drag and move this node around. And as I move it, the sound of the reverb still moves really smoothly and transitions between these different effects in a really nice way. Take a listen. Even cooler, we can also automate the position of this inside of our DAW. So I've gone ahead and added some lanes here for the shape X and the shape Y, and I could just draw in some kind of a random shape if I wanted to, maybe using the pencil tool and turn off the grid here. There's the X, there's our Y, and now this is moving automatically as we are playing through this sound. Now, why is this so cool? Couldn't you just kind of put a volume shaper after a reverb and achieve the same effect? Well, no, actually, because the way this is working, this is actually controlling the amplitude of the reverb kind of each time it's triggered. It's like the amplitude swell of the actual room itself, meaning that every sound that goes through this reverb is gonna have the reverb tail kind of applied to it. And you can get some really odd and interesting rhythms because of this, because you're not controlling the level or dry wet or amplitude of the reverb as a whole. To demonstrate this, I've got this plucky sound right here. It's really simple. Let's go ahead and add SpaceBlender here, and then adjust this XY position so that we kind of have this swell in the middle of the reverb. Let's set our sync here to, say, 2 beats. And now we're gonna get this reverb swell from every single note, and it's gonna be kind of timed differently, which is really, really cool. In this way, it's kind of acting almost like a delay instead of a reverb. It's just, it's got this like swell effect instead, which is really cool and really versatile. Of course, we could also have this reversed, and we could even pull the texture all the way down to get this interesting grainy effect, and maybe increase the mix and decrease the mod to see what it sounds like. Now, there's obviously so many situations where you could use SpaceBlender in really cool ways. You could use it for some awesome gated reverbs. You could use it for those kind of interesting rhythmic ideas that we were using before. Or you could play around with automating a bunch of different parameters, freezing it, resampling it, and creating some really cool effects just like this. So here I've just got this kind of basic low-pass supersaw sound. And what I've got here in Ableton Live is this 4th audio track actually set to resampling so that I can record the output of my main track. I've got SpaceBlender here on the wavetable track. Let's turn this on, open up the interface. Then all I'm gonna do is just hit record, and then I'm gonna play some notes on my Ableton Push, hit this freeze button, and then play around with things like the warp, timing, and this XY position here to create some really interesting sounds and textures that I could resample and use in future music productions. stop recording and then take a look at what we've got. And if I mute the original track, we've recorded all of that to audio, and I could go and splice this up and maybe get some really cool riser effects or something like that, or just some interesting sounds that I could use in a track. Now, do I think SpaceBlender is the perfect reverb plugin? No, but it is a really, really awesome creative effect. I do wish it maybe had a lower minimum time and maybe some other effects and parameters in there, but I do really like its simplicity and its interesting and unique approach to reverb. And of course, at the moment, as I'm recording this, it's free. I got it for free. You can get it for free too, as long as you're watching this before May 22nd, 2025. So there's really no reason not to try it out and see what it can do for you. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, click the like button, subscribe if you're new, and feel free to sign up to my newsletter to stay up to date with what I'm doing and for cool information on news and plugins like this one. If you want to learn more about how Ableton Live's reverb works, check out this video right here. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed, I hope you learned something, stay awesome, and I'll see you all in the next video.